Hello, I am Kat. This is Dave. Geo's on assignment. This is the 60th episode of the Unifying Force. How are you, Dave?
I am doing well. I find it hard to believe that we have done 60 of these things at this point. Um, it really seems like I know it's like every other week and it just keeps kind of building on you, but still doesn't seem like it's that much.
Yes. So today we decided to do something special, and we thought that we've all heard the story about how George Lucas made Star Wars. It's a tale as old as time, practically, and it's been told a billion times. And so one thing that really stands out is how George said he wanted to assemble the class of 2001, meaning get all of the effects artists who worked on the Stanley Kubrick film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Because surprisingly, despite how groundbreaking that film was, it didn't inspire a bunch of knockoffs, and the effects industry continued to die after that. And George very famously did track down the majority of these people and got them to work on the film and make Star Wars effects and stuff look as good, sometimes even better, than 2001. Uh, Now, earlier this week, I got to see a 70 millimeter transfer of 2001, which was created in 2018 by Christopher Nolan, and he didn't remaster it, but he only mastered it so it looked exactly as it did to audiences in 1968, imperfections and all, which was quite a unique way to approach it. And so I had never seen the film before. I'd avoided it deliberately because I'd heard that it's a movie kind of like Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which basks in its own effects, and the pacing is all over the place, like kind of inconsistent. It's like, okay, do I want to watch this? And I finally went there to see it, and it was good. Um, a bit long. It didn't need the intermission. The movie wasn't long enough to warrant an intermission, but they put one in there anyway. I think the first half of the soundtrack is excellent, and it helps make up for but the visuals are more mesmerizing in the second half, even though the soundtrack doesn't pick up as much in the second half, which is interesting. And I could definitely see all the other movies which borrow from it, particularly Interstellar. Several major plot beats of 2001 are copied in that film. Uh, but I did find certain aspects of the film were a bit indecipherable until my friend filled me in about information from the tie-in novel that Arthur C. Clarke wrote. And I'm like, okay, that makes more sense. Um, but it was very just out there, and it's crazy when you hear about even the different editing techniques they came up with for this film. So what are your thoughts, Dave? When did you first discover this movie?
Okay, I don't know when I first discovered this movie because I have seen it so long ago and so many times. But just let me begin with I am flabbergasted that you have never seen this movie before. Because I mean, this is got to be in the top 20, if not top 10 of the 100 greatest movies of all time on like half a dozen lists, if not more. Um, and it's just okay, if you haven't, anybody watching who hasn't seen this movie, when you go watch this movie, there are so many things in it that are ingrained into pop culture at this point that you don't even realize. Now, you are going to raise the ire of many science fiction fans even mentioning Star Trek the Motion Picture in the same sentence as this movie.
That's the thing. I don't subscribe to that. I did that last year when I was talking about why I didn't like The Godfather. And rather than anybody debating the points in the film that I was talking about in terms of why I didn't like it, they just went on whining about the legacy. And but the legacy. I'm like, yeah, okay, the legacy, but I'm talking about the actual movie and the actual content of the actual film.
Completely. Because I am not one of those people that say because it's a classic, you can't point out things and this and that are different. But you were talking about let's start with a point here. You're like, it didn't need an intermission. This is like what, like a 2 hour and 10-minute movie or something like that?
Like 2 hours, 17 minutes, 2 hours, 15 minutes plus like a 13-minute intermission.
Yeah, but
and it didn't feel like it, and it's weird because if you knew you were going to put in an intermission, maybe it would make sense to put it at because the film is broken down into four sequences. Yeah. There's the dawn of man, there's the journey to the moon to figure out what's going on up there, and then there's the mission, the next mission, the Jupiter mission to get to Jupiter, and then there's everything that happens beyond that through the wormhole. And they kind of put it around during the third portion of the storyline, not between any of the stories where there would be a natural break for an intermission, but like in the middle of the HAL 9000 subplot. It's like, oh, here's an intermission. And as slower as the movie was, I thought it kind of broke the rhythm a bit to put it in there, and thought, well, this is a little odd.
Well, number one, you have to remember that this is 1968 audiences. This is an extraordinarily long film for 1968. You know,
The Bridge on the River Kwai is a 3-hour movie, or about 3 hours, and that I don't think that. I mean, that might have had an intermission. I can't remember. But they planned where they put it.
But that again wasn't the norm either. I mean, what else?
I think long movies were a lot more common back then, because they used to put out Hollywood used to put out a lot of long epics. Like they'd put out 4.5-hour, 5-hour movies like Spartacus. Like they would do that, and people would accept the intermissions, and they would plan in advance where they put them. Sort of like how TV shows today, not the streaming ones, but actual TV shows, they know where the commercials are going to be, and they write around that so it doesn't feel as abrupt. Here, I just felt like they kind of just arbitrarily dropped one in, similar to how Martin Scorsese was complaining a few months ago that theaters were putting intermissions in Killers of the Flower Moon without just randomly placing it in there. And yeah, there's an argument to be made for a movie over 3.5 hours that it should probably have an intermission, but you should still find out where to put the intermission to make it feel appropriate. And I felt like it kind of broke my immersion a bit with this movie when it pops in.
I cannot imagine that as involved in all parts of the movie as Stanley Kubrick was, that he didn't purposely put that there for whatever reason he had.
Right.
He intended it to be that way. I don't think this is not the kind of thing where he would have let a studio pressure him into, oh no, we got to do it and we got to do it. No, he put it where he wanted it. It's the deal. But like this whole thing you're right. It's sections of this and that and the other. I mean, I think in my memory, I don't think there's a voice in the first 25 minutes of this movie. I don't think
that didn't bother me at all. I thought that I admit that the Dawn of Man sequence went on a bit long. It's like, okay, I get it. You're starting with that, and we've seen that spoofed a million times. Most recently in Barbie, just 6 months ago.
Oh yeah.
And initially, I didn't make the connection that the monolith had anything to do with why they start using tools, because it seemed like the ape was just playing around with the bone, and once it realized it could smash something, it decides to use it as a weapon. And it wasn't until the end of the movie when Dave's on his deathbed and he touches the monolith and he turns into the fetus. I'm like, oh, okay, so the monolith is what is prompted this. And so whoever put the monolith there in the beginning is spurning human evolution and sending it on its way. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. And then I assumed that since they never tell you that the monolith on the moon is the same one from Earth that just got transported there and buried, and humans touching it and causing the radio signal is what is alerting the higher intelligence out there that humans are now capable of, space travel. So that now we're of interest to them, if you so to speak.
Well, again, there's your comparison to Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Yeah, and Interstellar, where you have
that's where V'ger goes.
Right, and then the same thing with Interstellar, where they get the radio signal and the wormhole at Jupiter, and the HAL 9000 sequence from Interstellar, and the airlock sequence from Interstellar, and the Tesseract scene from Interstellar. It's like, geez, that whole movie's just ripping. Like, I watched that and I'm like, no wonder Christopher Nolan supervised the transfer of this one. He really loves it.
Oh, yeah.
But I did also find it funny that the cover story they come up with is, oh, there's an epidemic or something on the moon. It's like, you could have just said there was like a communications issue and that's not a big deal, because when you say that there's an epidemic, people are going to get concerned. That's going to draw more eyeballs on you than less. So that was kind of funny. But yeah, I wasn't bothered by the length of time or the lack of voices. Some people are bothered, but I don't mind if a movie doesn't have dialogue if it doesn't need it.
So I don't mind it at all. I don't mean to imply that, but it's that people going in and expecting in the title 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the first 25 minutes of it are a bunch of monkeys moving around and doing this to classical music. And people are going like, what the hell? It's like, you've got to see the rest of the movie to go back and get the first part. They're just like, wow. And then once you do, when you sit there and go, oh, you've just seen and witnessed this kind of like time loop. Is this created that? And that's why, I mean, for
Yeah,
me,
I admit I was a bit lost by the ending because it's like, okay, I get that it's created evolution, it's inspired that, it's turned Dave back into a fetus, and now it's sending him back to Earth, but why? And it turns out that contemporary audiences interpreted it much differently because in 1967, the United States and the Soviet Union mutually agreed that they weren't going to put nukes in space.
mm,
And a lot of people interpreted the famous transition from the bone being thrown into the air to the spaceship as, oh, these are military space vehicles with a bunch of weapons and everything pointed at the Earth. And now that the aliens have seen, or the higher intelligence beings or whatever have seen that, oh, you really haven't changed that much. Like technologically, yes, but
yeah.
conceptually, you're still obsessed with weapons and destroying yourselves. So it's time to reboot evolution and send humans back to the fetus and start over again, and send them back there either to destroy the Earth or to optimistically inspire them to be better. But watching it now 56 years later, there was nothing overtly military about those space vehicles. So I didn't make the connection.
Mhm.
And so it was like, okay, so I could see the transit technology leads to, from the bone, and now we're going to space. But I couldn't figure out one way or another why they turned Dave into a fetus and sent him back there. But that contemporary reading makes a lot more sense. I'm like, okay, that does really have a lot to say about it. And Kubrick is very careful in his lifetime, not telling. He said, look, any interpretation you want is fine. But after he
Mhm.
died, a secretly recorded interview was published where he said that, look, that he doesn't go back to destroy the Earth in the book, and the book is a companion piece written concurrently with the film.
Right,
And
and Kubrick
he
had a good bit of influence, and I think helped really kind of co-author with Arthur Clarke
right,
is that book. And Clarke, because it's not a visual medium, it's the written word, he chose, and he needed to, it necessitated him explaining a whole lot of this, a whole
right,
lot more than the film. Kubrick has always said that I left it open-ended, wishy-washy. The enjoy of the music is he compared this not to really a movie, but more like a musical piece, or a painting.
right.
This is an art piece. This is not. I am not here to tell you this one story. I'm here to put this in front of you and let you gather your emotional thing from it.
Right. And to that end, a lot of people also were noting that because Kubrick's previous film was Doctor Strangelove,
Mhm.
that, oh, this is cynical. This is about criticizing humans for being about weapons. But again, that's a very contemporary reading of it. Whereas me watching it now, it's like it feels much more like an art film, like you said, because it's not really decipherable. It's like I could track the logic and how we get from primitive to the moon to Jupiter to the wormhole to to the
Yeah.
tesseract thing and back, but as far as figuring out what it means, it's like, that is a bit open ended.
Well,
Kubrick said he received a lot of fan mail from that. Average film goers felt the ending was very optimistic, whereas critics and scholars felt it was very pessimistic. And I thought that was kind of surprising because the scholars were thinking about, oh, his previous movie, and they were thinking about, what was going on in the world with weapons of mass destruction and the idea of space, conquering space, and what that's going to mean. And it's like, and Kubrick, of course, didn't really respond to anybody except to be very diplomatic about it and say, well, it is what you want it to be.
well, see, I think that this is a film. So you have films that don't that don't carry over well, right? That aren't applicable in modern times, or they're films that still are applicable in modern times. This one, I think, changes as the times change. Is
Mm,
that I can only imagine that you have a different interpretation of it than other people would, because you've seen things that evolved from this movie could easily be interpreted as like a birth of a multiverse. You've seen the Marvel multiverse, and once you're in the wormhole, that's kind of multiverse right there. You've seen Stargate, Stargate and the aliens that proliferated life around the galaxy. And so, 1968 viewers hadn't seen that.
That's
They didn't.
interesting. 'Cause I didn't think multiverse. I thought like wormhole, like like a folded space, like a way to get from point A to point B. Because when
Right.
he comes out of the wormhole, you see. these landscapes, which are in a sense earthen, but with all the colors and everything, it's very alien lands. It's supposed to be like these alien planets. And apparently the wild tetrahedron type shapes that pass by are supposed to be actual aliens, because Kubrick didn't like that in sci-fi films up to that point, aliens were always very humanoid with rubber masks and stuff. And he didn't like that. And he's like, well, no, it should be alien. That's why it's called Alien. And so and in the book, Clark explains that these were supposed to be aliens, but in the movie, there's no hint that that's what it's supposed to be. I just thought, okay, he's flying by these funky looking shapes once he comes out of the wormhole. And then you don't get the transition for when he ends up in the Tesseract. He's just kind of there in this terrarium. But he did mention earlier in the movie how Dave does like neoclassical stuff, which is why the room is very neoclassical in architecture and design, which was interesting. And then you have that weird thing where he's standing there in his red astronaut suit looking at an older version of himself eating dinner, and then suddenly the astronaut disappears and it's just the guy eating dinner, who then notices himself even older on his deathbed, which prompts the guy in the suit eating dinner to disappear. And now it's just the guy in his deathbed who's there. It's like, it's like he kind of transformed and became that. So that's like really interesting.
Well, see, that's where I kind of get multiverse, because if, the events happen of the movie where he becomes the fetus, then the old man laying in the bed didn't ever happen in his timeline.
Well, because that happens when he touches the monolith too.
Yeah.
Like he touches it and then he turns into the Star Child, as they call it. And then another thing which really stuck out, which I thought was sort of the odd man out in the movie, was the HAL 9000 subplot. Because in the movie, it's a very straightforward, easy to decipher, simple little obstacle the crew has to deal with that has some tension and suspense and action. In the book, it's far more intellectually stimulating, because in the book they address why Hal did what he did to begin with, and it's because he had two contradictory orders. One is that you must always be truthful and transparent with the crew of the ship because you are responsible for running the ship. The second thing was that Mission Control said you are not allowed to reveal the purpose of this mission until you get to Jupiter's, star system or whatever. And Hal's like, well, even though the astronauts aren't asking me what the mission parameters are, the fact that I'm not telling them means I'm lying to them and I'm violating my prime directive. And so Hal made the decision that it's more important to be truthful with the astronauts on the actual ship, whom I'm responsible for, than to be truthful with Mission Control. So he lies and says that this antenna is going to fail, hoping that the astronauts will allow it to fail, so that way Mission Control cannot monitor him when he's going to tell them the truth, or tell them the truth about what the mission is. But because the astronauts don't take the bait, and instead to talk about what's shut him down, he's like, I can't let myself be shut down because we need to finish the mission. But because the mission doesn't require the astronauts, it just requires the telemetric material on the ship. And because the mission control has superiority over the astronauts, the fact that the astronauts are not part of the mission implies that they are expendable. Therefore, if I kill them, I will not have to violate the second rule, which is to be truthful with the crew, because there will be no crew to be truthful with. And that's so fascinating that he's working out this logic in his head, and I love that. But in the movie, you don't get any of that. It's just, it's an anomaly. Is how on the fritz, maybe not. And it's just, and I thought,
I don't know. I kind of got, I didn't get that much the detail of it, but my first viewing of this, I had already seen, Star Trek, the original series. Okay. And so I get from that kind of tale of AI and what's going on is the logic behind, Kirk arguing the alien computer to death, is he's got the alien computer and he sits there and he gives it this logic loop that it gets in. And that one, of course.
Yeah. And there was another one I thought people are going to be upset for me invoking this movie with 2001 as well, but John Carpenter's Dark Star, about this crew, and their job is to destroy unstable planets that are in the neighborhood of planets that might be colonized by humans in the future. And they have these artificially intelligent bombs, and the joke is that the bomb doesn't need to be artificially intelligent, but because we have this technology, let's just use it. Well, the craft is so derelict that they come up with a problem where the clamps that are supposed to release the bomb won't open, but they've already initiated the detonation sequence, and the manual override is not working. So the astronaut goes outside to talk to the bomb and says, hey, since we're the ones who input this, we need you to do this. And the bomb's like, well, you didn't input that order, so I can't really follow it. And he's like, yes, you can follow it because I'm your boss and you don't have any rights to defy me because you're not a living thing. He's like, well, if I'm not a living thing and I can't think, then how can I use any logic to assume that you are in charge? I'm supposed to follow the prompts. And so then it gets into a Morton's fork paradox, which is opposite things yielding the same result. So then the astronaut concedes, fine, you can think and you could use logic. Therefore, logically, you know I am in charge and that we will all, and the mission will fail if we don't get the clamps open. So cancel the detonation sequence. He's like, well, wait a minute. You just told me that I'm not real and I can't think, but now you're telling me to use logic to understand. So if I think, then that means I am a being, I am existent, I do have rights, and I can make this decision, and then it detonates anyway and kills everybody. So it's like the Morton's fork paradox, opposite actions yielding the same result. But that was a neat conversation, albeit in the vein of a comedy, because it is intellectually stimulating to think about how you have that type of argument, like you mentioned with Kirk arguing the alien computer death with a logic loop. Whereas in 2001, Hal very reasonably mentions that I can't let you sabotage the mission. And when Dave gets back inside, he doesn't really engage with Hal until he's starting to basically lobotomize him. And one of Hal's first inputs was to sing that song Daisy, because Arthur Clarke saw that that's one of the first things that AI computers did, was sing that song Daisy at a university. And so Dave just tells him to do that, sing the song to buy time for him to keep, disabling. And you notice he doesn't take out all of the slots because Hal still needs to run the ship. But I just thought the way those other films you mentioned, like Star Trek the Motion Picture and Dark Star, was so much more intellectually intriguing. Whereas in the movie, I felt that in a film which leaves so many open-ended questions and so many things to debate, I didn't feel the Hal segment, as famous as it is and as many spoofs and parodies and imitations there are, I didn't feel it was that deep in the way they portrayed it. I felt that there was some key missing information there that was needed to really open that conversation.
I really kind of read more into the house sequence because I look at a lot of what's come from that. And I mean, this is giving Hal the artificial intelligence and letting him run the ship, and that he just decides, oh, I don't need you. That's Judgment Day. Okay, that's Terminator right there. Is I'm reading all of these things already into it. Is he like, yes, this was from a very basic position, but that's what leads to the movie AI. That's what leads to Terminator and T2, and this is what we're going in. And I seriously doubt that 1968 audiences saw that, because 1968 audiences didn't have electronic devices with that level of sophistication in every home. They're not, if computers took over, okay, great. The computers like manning this one thing. I mean, computers weren't even that much completely in charge of nuclear weapons at that point. It still required human interaction. Whereas today is, if you give the helm to the computer and the computer becomes self-aware, you better be finding, Linda Hamilton, because you're going to need her. It's just like, so I think it's that is I really enjoyed the fact that I get to interpret whatever I want, because I have not read the book. I haven't. I know there's more information in the book, but I've never read that. I've only seen the film, and I've seen the film, I don't know, a dozen times, probably in its entirety, and then bits and pieces everywhere. And it's like I said, it's just, okay, how many times have I not heard the joke because my name is Dave? It's like that's what I get. Hello, Dave.
Yeah. That's good. That is great. But yeah, that was I thought that was an interesting sequence, and then I was mesmerized by the visuals of the wormhole. That was so cool.
Well,
and
that's Summer Love. That's 1968. That's like, let's take.
Well, that was the tagline of the movie that some people say it's like the ultimate trip, and it really is once you get to the ending of that movie. And they're like, you zoom through this wormhole that goes on for quite a while, and it was even designed in a way to convey the point to the audience. They understand that you don't actually see the ship get sucked into it. You just see like a POV shot and it's suddenly there, but you get the idea of what's going on. And we've seen, again, like you mentioned with Stargate, doing their own version of that. And then Nolan doing a very realistic version of what a wormhole would probably look like, also at Jupiter's rings. And it's like, wow, that looks really cool as well. And then I admit I was kind of at a loss for what the different colors on the planets were supposed to mean. Like when you're at the blue planet that has like the red water, is that supposed to be lava? Maybe. And then you see some of it with green, and it's like it's kind of all over the place, and it's not. It's like, is he going over multiple planets? Is it one planet? But it's like really kind of surprising because
Well,
back then you didn't have the Hubble telescope either to take pictures of what's way out there in the cosmos. So it's up for grabs. What you want to, how you want that to look.
well, that's where he gets wacky and crazy, and he just, it's almost like the Spielberg's what he's always said with Jaws, which is, if I've had them for this long, at the end, I can blow up the shark. I can do anything I want to.
Mhm.
I've kept their attention for this period of time. This is mine to do with. But let's talk about like how realistic the visuals are for the whole rest of the time. I mean,
Oh yeah, the
this,
space.
this is 1968, and this is why people think you could have faked the moon landing, because Kubrick made a moon landing better than the actual moon landing.
Yeah,
That's just why, because I mean the spacesuits were relatively accurate
yeah.
to Apollo era, but then taken and bumped up a notch. The
And they
visual
used
effects.
the ship designs were also very realistic. Like
Mhm.
when they're taking advantage of the zero G to walk upside down, moving around. It's like that's exactly how some of the other ships would be designed. The Jupiter ship, the Discovery One, that's
Yeah.
also a very logical design for a long missions like that. Uh, and so that was really cool. And the fact that it looked like the spaceships were occupying the space that they were in, it didn't look like something that was cropped on a screen like it was. It looked very real.
Well, they didn't put unnecessary like galaxies and stars and all of the
Right.
things that you see in Star Trek and Star Trek The Next Generation. It's like, no, here is the ship against blackness.
Yeah.
And you sit there, and if you just watch science fiction, you're like, oh, that's like fake. They just didn't do very good effects. And you're like, no, no, wait.
Mhm.
Science fiction shows, and this is the birth. I mean, is it the birth? I mean, this is the birth of modern science fiction for
Well,
darn
yeah,
sure.
like even when they in the beginning, when you'll notice the difference in the costumes between the apes who are more primitive, who are not using weapons, and the ones who are more starting to become more upright, and
Yeah.
the way their shoulders move and stuff, and the way the masks are more articulate, as the to differentiate the ones who are more primitive than the ones who have encountered the monolith and becoming on their journey to becoming more human. And that
Yeah.
was, Stuart Freeborn did that for the guy, worked on Yoda and stuff. That was state of the art in its day, the way they made that stuff, and that's something else George Lucas pilfered for the for Chewbacca's mask for Star Wars. And
Well, and I
now,
think he
so you're having
pilfered.
effects on all levels being revolutionized in this film.
I think he pilfered a lot of the kind of concept of the ape, and I think he has a name, but I don't know what it is or whatever. But the ape that's banging and beating on the bones and the whatever. Well, that was, I believe, done on an elevated platform so you could shoot up, because
Mhm.
they filmed it in like they're like a highway or something in the background, and they're just doing everything in camera, and it's like Yoda's running around on this elevated platform, so you can physically manipulate and you get all the camera work and things. So I mean, yeah, is I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm watching. I've got it playing while we're talking too, so I can. But you look at these shots of the Jupiter ship moving across frame, and this black and white, very Spartan. That's the Star Destroyer coming across the screen in the very first. Yeah,
Yeah.
is there's reality.
Look at the
That's
insides of
reality
these
is.
corridors.
His EVA suit there is bright orange because the space shuttle, which was years and years ahead of this, they made those bright orange ones. So if an accident happened, oh, you can find that dude. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
is
like this dude right here, Frank.
yeah, and that's my question is that life imitating art or art imitating life? Because he did this before NASA did it. I'm betting there's some NASA engineers who created that orange suit who had watched this movie.
Well, a lot of the interiors and stuff, because this was 1968, and they were already making rockets and testing them years before then as well. So, like the Apollo 1 fire, that was January 1967. So they already had a lot of those designs in the making for quite a while.
But I'm talking about like the orange and stuff. The orange suits didn't, to my knowledge, I think come in until like the shuttle era.
Yeah, that was the shuttle
era. They're doing white and they're doing foil and that kind of that you see earlier in there. But it's a lot of things, and he's I think better predicting what an accurate space future may be. I mean, it's very likely not going to be Star Trek. We're not going to not be concerned with money and everything else. And the moon base sequence or whatever, where you've got like Hilton, they're in the
Howard Johnson
on the moon, or the Howard Johnson or whatever. It's going to be that. We're not losing capitalism that easily. So yeah.
I don't know if Howard Johnson's is going to make the jump to space, but we'll see.
Well, but Hilton might.
Yeah.
You know,
I don't think people are going to be colonizing space. There's a reason the space race kind of ended when it did. It's like, oh, outer space is a lot more inhospitable than we thought, and the nearest inhabitable planets are much, much further away than we thought. And it's, spoiler alert, it's not Mars.
Yeah. So I don't know. But you know, you get the mix of things where, what is it? The terraforming, I think Frakes says, Riker says at one point, in my time, there are 60 million people living on the moon or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't picture something like that ever happening because the moon doesn't have any resources. And it's like you'd have to ship all the resources up there. And it's like, I'd say no, people will be able to adapt to some of the worst aspects of climate change, and then they would be able to adapt to life on the moon. And same with life on Mars. It's like there's nothing on Mars anymore. There was once, but it's long since dead, and it's outside the Goldilocks chain, if you will. Venus is another story, however. Venus's atmosphere is so thick, you could literally have a cloud city there. And that's probably what inspired George also when he was, because again, in the original Star Wars, it was not going to be the Death Star. It was going to be an Imperial prison, and it was designed to look just like Cloud City. But you could literally have actual cloud cities in Venus, and that's been very much thought of and designed. You can harvest minerals there. So I'm surprised that so many people are obsessed with going to Mars, but it's like, dude, Venus is a lot closer, and there's actual minerals you can mine and bring back and live there without having to terraform the whole thing. It would just be, you know, this almost like a terrarium floating in the atmosphere type of thing, you know?
Well, I mean, maybe that's the point, is maybe that's where the minerals and the materials come from, and it's easier to ship them to Mars than it is to ship them back to Earth. It's, you're kind of way stationy. I don't know. But let's talk about more about how this film influenced George and how George went ahead, because you sit here and you look at this film. If you did not know when this film was made and you look at the visual effects and this sort of thing, you're going to sit there and go, oh man, who made this? ILM? You know?
Yeah.
Wait.
They did. It's like, yeah, they did. They just weren't called ILM at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's that kind of thing. Is that's exactly where I can't imagine that George didn't sit there and see that and go, okay, yeah, I want a ship that like comes across there, but I want to like make it pointy and more ominous, and let's make it clear that these are the bad guys.
Well, also with the ships, like, you know, Darth Vader's design in the helmet was simply because Ralph McQuarrie's like, well, if the ship got abducted or into the lower opening docking bay in the open vacuum of space, then how do the troopers and Vader get in to the ship without, you know, vacuuming? It's like, well, how about you just give them helmets? And that's why stormtroopers have those helmets, which look like they have breathing apparatuses on it. Same with Darth Vader.
Right.
Granted, because they attached their vacuum seal before they cut open the door where the rebels without, you know, that equipment is. But it's another thing, like with 2001, the way they portrayed, like you said, the inside of the spaceships and the suits and how the movement works in the zero G, it's all very real and not like sci-fi, everything's just, it might as well be like you're on an airplane, or even better than an airplane. We're walking around in a big building, except it's actually a spaceship.
Well, see, I don't. I'm sure there is, and somebody out there in the chat, or you may even correct me. I don't recall seeing a more realistic depiction of astronauts in space between this movie and Apollo 13.
Yeah, maybe The Right Stuff. I haven't seen that whole film, but that would be another one.
The Right Stuff was a little bit more like primitive-y kind of thing, because you're seeing the beginnings and a lot of the testing. Because The Right Stuff, I love that film, but it focuses on a lot of the kind of Earth-based things that they did to get those pilots ready to go into space. But I'd have to go back and look at their space sequences again. But just for the sheer volume of how much activity occurs in space, is, I would just say, there to Apollo 13. And Apollo 13, of course, was done by riding the Vomit Comet, the same way that they test astronauts, as they built all those sets, practical sets, on an airplane that they could artificially create weightlessness in the atmosphere.
And that is just so crazy to think about, to film a movie like that and have it work as well as it does. It's like, you think shooting on a boat is hard, shooting on an airplane going
yeah, you get like so many seconds of filming before you get so many seconds of useless, because you're plastered to the floor.
Love to be the pilot on that thing.
Move.
God.
But what else in this do you think, influenced George?
Well, one, it's not just how realistic it looks, but it also has to be, not that it looks real, but it also has to feel believable to the audience. Like, it can't just be, oh, throw something in there funky for the sake of looking like that. Like, say, Forbidden Planet, where you go to the planet and you see all these crazy designs for everything, and they try and write it off as, oh, well, it's just the alien or the Krell used to live here. But why you have these massive chasms of massive buildings? Like, what is this? There's no, like, with Star Wars, they had a logic to it, and it's like, oh, it's the used future. People live here. What's this going to be like? Yeah. Sort of like 2001. What would this actually be like with the technology we have? Even though 2001 obviously was set at the time in the future, it still looks like reasonable. It was very much predicting where space travel very much is still today. And so it also influences how they actually made the effects. Because again, it's such a bizarre anomaly that 2001 was such a mesmerizer of a movie when it came out. Didn't get nominated for many awards. It got an effects award, like a special Oscar for that, but it didn't inspire a bunch of knockoffs. Like, the industry just went back to doing the same cheap type of effects stuff they were doing already. And I don't know if that's because the tech was used in an artsy film rather than a more traditional narrative movie. But when George did it, because it's a narrative film where he's not, basking in the effects, and because admittedly there are some scenes which go on for quite a while. It takes them a while to get there, because they're really showing you how this stuff looks. Whereas when George uses it just as another tool, like, this is the world it's in, this is what it looks like, we're going to tell the story.
Well, that's true. You would have these beautiful, amazing effects and sets and things, and George would have, like, Luke and Han and Leia just, like, running through them and getting shot at, and running back and shooting again, instead of just like, oh, let's play some classical music and go in slow-mo and just kind of do a wide shot and look at all the stuff I made.
Right. And so that is where you see a lot of knockoffs of Star Wars, not just from narrative, because, I mean, the narrative honestly has been borrowed from a billion other movies, but
we talked about that. If you want to go see that, go back and look at the hero's journey episodes, like the early Unifying Force.
Yeah, but the effects, I find that they've started copying that a lot after Star Wars, because it's like, oh, we could use this stuff in a... It's almost like people watched 2001 and they thought that because that was a very realistic portrayal of what space travel would be like, very slow and very laborious with the suits and everything, that, oh, well, that's not going to be conducive to a great storytelling, to moving along a zip-zappy story. And then George is like, yeah, it is. Just imagine if it's more technologically advanced. Don't have it be so out of this world in design that people won't recognize what it is.
Yeah.
But you could still have it be there and tell a story. And people are like, oh, we can use it for that. And then and then that just kind of took off and became its own thing. And so that was something that I think was innovative for George at the time, because he even had visuals that vaguely looked like this in THX 1138 with the design of this underground, this subterranean civilization. And granted, he was echoing a lot of, not just echoing, but copying a lot of George Orwell's 1984 novel. But visually, it does have a lot of cues with 2001 in terms of like the color schemes and the bright white, the star, all that kind of odd design. And the fact that in this one, they never really tell you, are they aliens? Are they not? Like in Interstellar, they imply that they might be future humans from another planet. They never really tell you that. And it's almost like Nolan telling the audience regarding 2001 that, hey, we don't really know where Dave ended up. It's just, he went through a wormhole, but is he at a planet? Is he in another dimension? We don't know.
Yeah, no.
Like, and we don't know why they sent him back, or how
is he just enjoying some fine pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, maybe the Earth was just a science project by maybe the Earth was a science project by these creatures who decided, well, let's see what happens if we do this and give them this power, this type of ability. And then you have the 140X moment in the movie when the astronauts touch the monolith and the ringing and the buzzing of that alarm was so real. Like I was covering my ears like crazy. Like I can't. This is too much. And then there was another such sequence later in the film during the HAL sequence. The alarm started going off. It was almost too loud and high pitched, much like it is for the astronauts. And you're watching it. But that's another thing. The sound design, clearly, the way it wasn't sci-fi swishing and swooshing and little weird little Lehrman devices or whatever. They instead made it like, what would it actually sound like? Like, for instance, while there's a lot of music in the first half, in the second half, they go with realistically where there wouldn't be any sound in space.
Yeah.
Like a whole airlock sequence. It's not until Dave seals the airlock chamber that you suddenly hear all the noise again. And it's like, I love that. And of course, that sequence, Nolan copied that in Interstellar. And it's so neat to watch those same types of realistic effects, but there's no sound because there wouldn't be any sound in space.
Yeah. Well, and think about the musical design with this is Kubrick going and finding pieces of music that already exist that fit the narrative he's trying to do. He didn't have John Williams.
Right.
Yeah, he didn't just get this score. The main deal is his theme music was not written for this. That's Thus Spoke Zarath. I cannot pronounce that. What are we looking at? The main theme of this is 2001. It's from a Richard Strauss poem, also Thus Spake Zarathustra. It was performed by the Vienna Philharmonic, and it's a piece of music. It's not
Richard Strauss.
This is 2001. That was already a thing. He built it around that.
Oh, right? Yeah, the Sprach Zarathustra, performed by the Berlin Philharmonic, conducted by Karl Bohm. A longer excerpt of Lux Eterna than in that film. Okay, that's right. Let's see. That's right. He did hire a composer, though. He hired Alex North to score the movie. He did it. And then when Kubrick watched it, he thought, it's not that it's bad music. It's just, this is more of an art piece, so maybe it should have something more artsy and more, and because the movie does end with a whole neoclassical bit, it seemed more fitting to have that type of music in there anyway. And so he picked that music instead, and they eventually released what would have been the score for the movie as its own soundtrack vinyl and eventually CD later on, because he didn't want the guys all that work to go to waste for nothing, which was nice. But yeah, it does feature a lot of those, because you could tell it would be put the movie in another level of the stratosphere if this music was written for the film.
Yeah.
I found it interesting that they don't really use much of that music in the second half. Like the first half, being somebody who grew up on Star Wars and all this type of stuff, the visuals, I'm like, yeah, they're good. And historically, I get how important it is for the time. But watching it as a modern audience member in the 21st century, it's like, okay, does this need to go on this long? No. But the sound makes it enjoyable. The music is really nice. But then in the second half, as they get more trippier, or they try and evoke more horror elements with Hal, they go from non-music with Hal and just hear the sound effects of Hal, which makes it scary. And then when you get to the climax where he's going through the wormhole, it's really just the weird sound effects of zooming through that hole that just that's mesmerizing on its own, and they don't have the classical music for that.
And
Even
do
when
you
he
know who
shows up
did
inside
sound
the
design for this? Is like, because that's another element that's very similar to Star Wars, where they went out and they used practical things to make, lightsaber effects. They made, effects
yeah,
for
like the
Chewbacca that
blaster
didn't
bolt.
exist.
The blaster bolt that you hear in all of Star Wars is just taking like a wrench and rattling the the steel cables holding up your telephone poles and stuff, and
Yeah,
that
got wire.
wiry kind of and stuff like that, and
Well,
then they
and then the other one is that there's more than one effect, like, that's combined. I think there was a microphone that they were recording this electronic hum of a projector or something. They did
right,
that.
and then
And
they
the
even went to
Doppler is then you play that and then you record it again, but you record it while you're moving the microphone like a lightsaber, and that's how
right,
you get the craziness.
and then he even used like World War I era planes being revved up and taking off for soundtracks for some of the ships firing up in like Attack of the Clones to make it feel very real, and then doing the first instance of faster than the speed of sound in Star Wars when you have, Jango Fett's sonic bombs go off, and it's like they apparently went back and forth for a while wondering what sound it should be, and they thought, what if it's faster than the speed of sound? Let's try that, and then it worked. And then of course they did that again famously in Last Jedi, where some people who didn't pick up on it had to put signs up in some movie theaters telling them that nothing's wrong with the soundtrack. This is supposed to happen.
Yeah.
I
Well,
bet it would be really cool to hear the sound of that with all those Star Destroyers splitting at the same time. That would be epic to hear that, but it is really, again, it felt like almost like a brief 2001 moment where just look at the visuals and how cool this looks.
yeah. Well, we talked about like some of the sound design again when we were watching episode 3 of the Ahsoka series last week. Is just how the starships in there, the little spaceships that they're doing in the battle, are still using like hot rod noises. They're engines of, because George does that.
Mhm.
Is he's a hot rod guy? So you hear that in space. Whereas in 2001, if you're doing a space battle, it's and nothing. But George is like vroom vroom vroom.
Mhm.
I think it's one of the things that we harp on this show a lot, is what makes Star Wars a blend of genres. It is not pure science fiction like 2001. It is got
Well,
science fictiony elements, but it's a lot of science fantasy as well.
well, 2001 is mostly science fact with the way they portray it up until the climax.
Mm,
Like in terms of how the spaceships operate, like the design for the ship to Jupiter is how they NASA scientists designed those ships for if you were to do long form like that I can't remember the name of it, but the ship that you see at the end of Interstellar, the rotating thing, they copy that in the Book of Boba Fett when you catch up with Mandalorian and he's on that
yeah.
space station rotating. That's literally how they designed it for long term space colonization because of how far the distances you would have to travel to
But
get there.
let me argue with this one. It's science fact now. It wasn't in
Mm.
1968. It
Well,
was
no, the way they
all
designed
it
some of
was
the ships and everything.
theoretical, and that was like, well, this is what we would do in the future. The NASA people, we wanted to create artificial gravity. We're going to spin the ship. Had they done that yet? Don't know that they had. And if they had, it was on a very small, very little bitty,
And then Star Wars will do weird things like, on the one hand, have those bombs fast things faster than the speed of sound, but then you hear sound in hyperspace when they're traveling through the light tunnel or whatever. Like just,
well, there are also whales in there, so that's all far
I don't know if
away.
George co-signs that. Maybe. It's like, oh, okay, here comes Pinocchio or Jonah or whatever. Would pick your poison.
It could have completely been. But yeah, I mean, so I think the long and the short and the long is if you have not gone, if you have not seen this film, it's available on Max or HBO Max or whatever it is that they're calling that now. Um, it's available. It's not going to be as amazing as Kat saw it again in the giant remastered or mastered.
That's interesting because I think that the 4K version I got here is probably, because I haven't watched the 4K version. I have it though. It's likely remastered, so it probably looks even better than it did in 1968, like more crisp. Because there were admittedly a lot of film artifacts on the screen throughout the movie, like little, it almost looked like dust particles or dirt or time, and it was. And in addition to what they call the cigarette burns, there was this little flickering, and because it was again trying to make it look as authentic as it originally did, not artificially adding it, but like it literally there because they scanned the negative and only mastered it. Whereas a remaster, you scan the negative and then you go in and clean it up bit by bit, frame by frame, and that's what they did for the 4K. But for the 70 millimeter transfer, it just looks like it did back then. So I expect
they didn't want it to look like antiseptic like digital would, is leave the element of shooting on film.
Yeah, they don't. Yeah, you don't have to apply a ton of DNR to get completely scrub the film grain out of it. Like some transfers do that, and it's really bad. But this one, I take it, you could still retain the filmic elements and have it be a smooth transfer. So,
yeah. So like if you haven't seen it, go see it. Watch this film and just like mind blown. So yeah. Okay. We started this last time, and I didn't tell you that I had it prepared for me, is viewer mail. Okay, people, you need to send us some viewer mail. Okay, I haven't gotten any actual questions on there. I've gotten a few comments and this and that. But so I had to go searching for some viewer mail for this. So I scour the group, I scour this, and I scour other groups. Okay, as I'm looking out there for unifying 4C kind of questions. This question was posed in the Mandalorian and Star Wars Universe Facebook group. Okay, and if it's so here we go. I'll hit you with this one. This is the question: if the Empire happened to come, and this relates to 2001 because of how realistic this is. If the Empire were to come to the Milky Way galaxy in force, and they were to target Earth in 2024, what would be the outcome? What would happen if the Empire, Darth Vader, and all the Star Destroyers showed up in the Milky Way? What's going to be the outcome?
They would just pass it by because there's not enough resources on Earth for it to really be worth their time. And then when you think about just logistically how you're going to exterminate all the populations of the Earth and all the differences with the different governments, the different culture, all this kind of stuff, they're not going to invest the amount of time that would be required for that. If they still felt that they wanted something from it, then they would maybe use the world devastators. If not just use a Death Star and blow it up, because the other planets in a solar system don't really provide them much. Well, some of them would for certain minerals, for colonies like that. But Earth, they might try and, wipe out the population and use it as their headquarters for this mineral galaxy. Like, oh, we're going to harvest stuff from Jupiter, the gases, and minerals from some of the moons of the other planets in the solar system. But being the Empire, I don't think they're going to try and sort through the logistics of human nature and human culture and all the different and deal with that. I think they would just want to, just wipe the population out, and we'll just camp out here as our relaxing headquarters while we mine all the resources.
Well, I mean, what we've got going for it, and I don't know that they need it because Star Destroyers provide an atmosphere, a livable, breathable, whatever atmosphere for whatever. So do they need it? I don't know. Maybe not. But do they want it? Do they want to enslave the population? Do they need to reinforce their stormtrooper brigade?
Well, they could use it as like a
that they apparently kidnap children from Rise of Skywalker. This is what they're doing to
They could use it as a way station for like or kind of like Scarif, like a secret base or something. But unlike the big difference is that in the Star Wars galaxies, the planets are very singular, not just in climate, but in terms of culture and the people who live there. It's all one singular government. It's much easier to deal with. Whereas the logistics
about that before on the show is that there's
right.
a reason beyond that.
Whereas the logistics of dealing that with Earth and sorting out who's going to sell it, who's going to join, who's not, it's like it would be like way too complicated. We're not going to take the time to learn who we can trust or who we cannot trust. Let's just wipe it out and be done with it. And so I think they would employ the world devastators to the effect that they need to exterminate most of the population and maybe bring a better species for slavery to there if they needed it, and maybe use it as a way station between galaxies, like a stopover if they want to.
Well, because I mean, if you're using Wookiees for slaves, we would make crappy slaves. You know, it's like we have.
And if you have droids that could do a lot of the work anyway, like a robot force, then go with that.
So my level of logic is just to be the humanist a little bit and have a little bit of faith, which is if they were to land and try and do a land invasion, we might have a shot. Because stormtroopers have notoriously crappy aim, even though we think that that's just kind of a plot device, and they're notoriously fragile. And we've talked about before too that their technology is based on energy weapons and that sort of things. And you start, hurling lead at stormtrooper armor, and no, that's not what it's made to defend against.
We'll be able to stop the Star Destroyers, though.
Oh no, is not at all. If they cared about if they didn't care about the planet, it's nuke us from orbit and we're done.
Well, I meant like in the sense
no shot whatsoever.
I meant that it would be like what you saw in the opening of Last Jedi, where they use the dreadnought cannon to take out a military base, and they could do that on the Earth and take out all of our major military bases first.
Well, they could, but again, remember the whole reason why the nuclear weapons had to be used on Japan is because they would hide behind every blade of grass, and the underground guerrilla resistance would make it impractical to do anything.
We're also going to go bankrupt before that projected victory date as well.
Yeah, they can sit there and the Empire could completely take out our main military bases and this and that from orbit, but you are going to run into certain populations, and like you said, the Earth is very diverse compared to Star Wars planets you would run into that guerrilla resistance that would make taking the planet at a ground level impractical. Yep. But the thing is about the Emperor and the Empire is, yeah, maybe they want it, but do they want it bad enough to where when it gets inconvenient for them, they might try an invasion? Okay, that didn't work. Yeah, just blow them off.
Not to mention, all the technology on the Earth would be foreign to them. And once you conquer everything, you'd have to learn how to work with that technology, or you'd have to just wipe it all out anyway to build anew. Right. And it's like, now you're racking up a lot of bills, and is it really worth all the trouble? Or you could just take the Death Star and just, bye-bye.
Well, I mean, I don't know if the Empire's budget is limited at all, because, I mean, we blow up one Death Star, what do? We build another one. We blow up a second Death Star, what do? We make Star Killer Base. Yeah, so I know that argument is completely valid. It's like budgetary. I think the Emperor.
Well, that's another reason why these proposed
Republic credits or something.
Well, that's another reason these proposed Mars colonies aren't going to work, because it would take like 3 times the global GDP to fund it for just 1 year. Like, just think about that. It's like, because of the amount of resources that have to be shoved out. It's like, no, it's not going to happen. And yet they keep pushing this pipe dream that we're going to colonize Mars. But it's like, do you know the next planet after Mars that you could potentially colonize? It's in another galaxy. It's like, you're not getting there. Like, Mars is far, but it's not that far.
No, you go beyond that, and we're looking at Dathomirian witches, or hitching a ride on some space whales to get to where we need to do.
Yeah, and that's why the space race largely ended when they realized that, well, even if we design those other rotating artificial ships and colony ships with hydroponics and all that to support everybody, one thing that sci-fi never really addresses is how are you going to find people psychologically who are going to be fine living generation after generation after generation on this ship, because it's going to take thousands of years to get to where you're going.
You get that in a few places. You get in Star Trek Enterprise, where their navigator, I think, is a boomer. He grew up off of Earth and on transports, and he was, where are you from? Earth, but not Earth. I'm from that freighter over there. That's where my parents lived, and they're the captain of that. And you get that. But anyway,
cosmonauts were very forward thinking about this. They did a test where they built in a warehouse a recreation of a ship they theoretically would use to go to Mars, and they put them in there running it as a simulation to see how long if it would work. And they had to cut it off after like a year and a half or something because one of them had a heart attack and they needed to intervene. But they wanted to test psychologically what would happen if you put somebody in there for that long in this little vehicle. Would they mentally even be able to take it? Would you go stir, that kind of thing, stuff that you really got to think about for, because obviously things like cryosleep and carbonite are just, science fiction. No, you can't freeze somebody into suspended animation. They die. That causes cellular death, people.
Right. But if you have any further questions, if you have any sort of things like that for us here, again, we have an email now, right there. VCUnifyingForce@gmail.com I check that on the semi-regular. It's not going to be, you send me an email and 5 minutes later I'm sending that back. I have like 8 emails at this point, people. So it's not that instantaneous. But by the time that we come to another 2-week rotation and we have a show, we'll have seen it. We may have responded to you, or we're going to respond here on the show. So please send us show ideas, send us questions for viewer mail right there. VCUnifyingForce@gmail.com. So final thoughts, Kat?
Yeah, very influential film. Good movie, great visuals. Yeah, I recommend it. And you could see how George did it for the class of 2001. That paid off. And that's another interesting question. Even as good as the characters and the story of Star Wars is, would it have been as well received if he didn't go out and get the class of 2001 to really sell you on that tech?
Yeah. Would the Star Wars story have been as compelling if it were like a 50s cheesy sci-fi rubber suit kind of? Would it?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I don't know. I mean, there are arguments for and against, because like I said, those kind of shows and movies were some of what George was looking at and inspired by, and he was fascinated enough with them to be inspired for it. So maybe we could have gotten, Star Wars story might have been cool enough in rubber suits, but with the effects and that class of 2001, you're talking about the people that made this movie and did those visual effects, ILM before it was ILM.
And then the other thing it inspired was having a proper musical score for a sci-fi type film rather than the typical, weird stuff that they would put for, again, sci-fi sounding sound effects as a substitute for music in a lot of those old sci-fi films. And no, he actually got a legit orchestra to compose music. And it's like, that was another thing that it did, and brought back the popularity of proper music scores, which had been waning in a lot of 70s films.
Yeah. So excellent. I think all agreed. 2 thumbs up. Go out there, see it again. Kat, you got to watch it more than one time, because you're going to get more the more times you see it. Oh yeah. In a while and do it. And now we got to bug Geo, and Geo's got to watch it because I want to hear a follow up on a future show. When
our part 2 of this will be an extension of that question. Would it have been? What would Star Wars have looked like if he didn't go out and get the class of 2001, which not just includes the effects, but again, the music and that whole thing. Yeah. And that would be, very interesting. Cool. Another thing I noticed this movie did, which was kind of ahead of its time, was you have in the second segment, or the first segment, you follow the primitive people and then they're gone. In the second segment, you follow this other character associated with government space travel, and then he's gone. And then you start with brand new characters in the third segment for the rest of the movie. which is kind of surprising. You usually
I
don't.
don't always see it that way. I saw it more of like, yeah, that until you've seen the whole thing, yeah, that's the feeling you get. But I was like, well, the government guy is that, and he just leads to what creates the Jupiter mission, and the Jupiter mission goes to the wormhole, and the
Oh no,
fetus.
I get that it's connected. I meant that.
But I really almost see the fetus as it's the chicken and the egg. Is the fetus at the end is reimplanted on the Earth, and does Dave not go to be one of the chimps? I mean,
I couldn't tell at the end if the um, when you see how supersized it is compared to the Earth, is that like a artistic flourish, or is it really supposed to be that big?
I don't know. I think
That's the thing. It's like I can't.
I think everything in Kubrick's deal was like, let's be as artsy as humanly possible. I think I'll have to read the book to actually give a fair opinion on that.
Yeah.
But anyway, that is our time for today. Thank you for watching The Unifying Force once again. And email us. Send us some ideas and things. If you want to hear,
Go pick this up.
and
HDR.
go watch that movie. All right. Until next time, may the Force be with you.
Always.